Now Daniel chapter 11, and I'm going to traverse the entire 400 years from this book, because this is probably the most remarkable prophecy in the Bible as far as in its clarity of the times. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but there's so much here. Look at Daniel 11:3. It says this in Daniel 11:3, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And that mighty king comes down like this, and his name is none other than Alexander, who conquers the world in lightning-like form." Let me just read to you how quickly he conquers the world. He becomes king of Greece in 336 BC. By 332, he has conquered all of Greece, and he comes to right here and destroys Tyre. This is how far Alexander gets right there by the year 332. So he's right here. And he doesn't become king until 336, did I say? Yeah. So in 4 years, he's knocked off all of European kingdoms over on that side, the whole Grecian peninsula and all the city-states. And in 4 years, he's come across and gotten Asia Minor, basically wiped all of the Roman province of Asia and Bithynia and Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia and all that. And he whips up and gets to that part by 332. And in 331, he leaves. He doesn't go any further south. He goes this way, and he gets Babylon in 331. And that's an amazing take, because if you remember, the Babylonians had conquered all of then they had taken over the Assyrian Empire, which was Nineveh, with all the wealth there. The Babylonians took all of Assyria's wealth. Persia combined that with the wealth of India and put everything together in Babylon and Persepolis. And Alexander takes all. And so that was an amazing conquest to get Babylon and to wipe out the Persian Empire. By the year 327, he's gone all the way to India. That's when he ran into the dragons. They had them in caves back then. Dinosaur dragons, alive, monsters, 100 feet long things, penned in. And Alexander in his military records records his run-ins with these monstrous dinosaur monsters that the Indian people of that culture in 300 BC, 3rd century BC, were worshiping. By 323, he claims to be God. He has wiped out all the way to Egypt and gone back to Babylon, where he dies in 323 BC. So he's only around for 13 years. Conquers the whole known world, dies of dissipation, dissolution, and leaves his imprint. He basically divides the world into his 4 generals. One takes Greece, one takes Egypt, one takes Syria, another one takes the northern stretches. He's the mighty king of Daniel 11:3. Look at verse 4. It says in Daniel 11:4, it says, "But as soon as he's risen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward 4 points." When did Daniel write that? Daniel wrote that in the 6th century BC. That's when Daniel was alive. Daniel died perhaps around 530, something like that, 521. He's writing it 150 years before it happened. And he says it's going to divide into how many parts? 4 parts, 4 generals. Before there was ever when Daniel's writing this, the Babylonians are at the zenith. And he says yet in verse 4 that this king that's going to do whatever he wants, who's Alexander from history, he's going to have 4 points of the compass, though not his own descendants. They're 4 generals. You know what Alexander's philosophy was? Whoever's strongest wins. When he was dying in his fever, his generals surrounded his bed and they said, "Who do you give the kingdom to?" He says, "Whoever's strongest." And they fought it out and they took it. Well, keep going. Verse 5, the king of the south. Now, whenever in here it's talking about the king of the south, that's this guy down here, the Ptolemean Empire, the Ptolemies. And specifically, verse 5 is Ptolemy I Soter. He reigned from 523 to 285 in Egypt. One of his commanders, as it says in verse 5, it says, "Then the king of the south," that's Ptolemy, "will grow strong along with one of his princes or commanders, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great domain indeed." And this is Seleucus I, and he added extensive territories to the Ptolemies. They bypassed the Seleucids and took over Babylon. And that's from history. And they do this up to the year 285. Now look at verse 6. It says, the daughter of the king of the south. Guess what? We know who she is from history. Her name is Berenice, with an E in it. And she is married to Antiochus. Antiochus is the guy that's running the story up here, the Seleucids. And so Daniel, the prophet, in chapter 11, is mapping out down to the event, day by day. This 11th chapter is one of the most powerfully revealing chapters. That's why, if you go to Harvard Divinity School, or Princeton Divinity School, or if you go to most of the liberal seminaries, they will say that Daniel was written sometime just before Christ's birth. Why do they say that? Because they can't stand the accuracy of the prophecy. They say no prophet could give accurate predictions that detailed into the future. If you look at verse 7 of Daniel 11, it says, but one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place. It's Berenice's brother who becomes Ptolemy III of Egypt, who did away with his competitors, just as it says. Look at verse 8. It says in 11:8, and their gods with their metal images and precious vessels of silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. What's that? The images of the Syrian deities and the images of all the Persian deities and the Babylonian deities, he takes with him. I mean, this is an event that took place in history in the time of this reign of Seleucus and of Berenice's Berenice's brother. Well, let me just get down to verse 12. It says in verse 12, when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up. He will cause tens of thousands to fall. Interesting that it says that. The historian Polybius records that Antiochus killed 10,000 infantrymen in one day, in one battle. And look what it says right there. It says, and thousands will fall. Just a few more. I mean, we could go through all this. There are whole books written on this. It says in verse 25 of Daniel 11, he'll stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. And by the time we get to verse 25, we're to Ptolemy IV. Remember, Ptolemy I is the guy that was the general here. Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III marries the Antiochus' daughter. Now we're down to Ptolemy IV. And that's down to verse 25. And we've gotten to the time about 170 BC. So we've gone from this split up occurring at 323. By this guy here, we're at 170 BC. So we've covered about 160 years with those four Ptolemies. They had pretty long reigns. But here's what happens. Verse 30. It talks about these ships, and this is another amazing historical event. In fact, when I was up at Word of Life speaking a couple weeks ago, there wasn't a lot to do. I was all alone, and I wasn't going to go out and risk my life on those ski slopes like all the other people were doing. And so I just sat in front of the fireplace and read one book after another. I read this massive book about the intertestamental period. I tell you what, I wouldn't waste my time on Stephen King horror books. You ought to read these things, because it's true. I'll just tell you one thing. In this time period, the Jews, now look where Jerusalem is, right here. Do you see them right here in the middle of this? It's the buffer between Syria and Egypt. And these people are fighting constantly. It's just like a seesaw. They're going back and forth. And you know what they do? When they march down, they would haul the Jews out of Jerusalem, and they would say, bow to our gods. And the Jews, by and large, would say, no, we won't. So you know what their favorite thing would be? And I'll only tell us once. I don't want to gross you out. They would take heated tongs, tie them up, and they would take pieces of their flesh out with the tongs, one piece at a time, and just tear them out until they would stop worshiping the true God. And you know what? The faith and the courage of these people was so much that there's record after record of father, mother, and one child after another, each getting tongued to death, and they wouldn't deny Jehovah. There was great piety, great devotion, great worship of God in the midst of the darkness, as we'll see in just a minute. I'll quickly come to the end of this. Look at verse 31 of Daniel. It says, and the forces from him will arise, and they'll desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and they will do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now we're getting in verse 31 where it starts transitioning between 169, 170, 166 BC, and starts talking about a greater defiler of the sanctuary, which of course is the Antichrist. Because remember, this blends right into the future. But the type is Antiochus Epiphanes. In 168 BC, he prefigured the Antichrist to come by taking and building an altar to the pagan god Zeus of Olympus, and he sacrificed a pig and poured the broth of boiling the pig over the sacrifice and defiled the whole temple, and then killed everyone in sight, just ravaged them. Well, what happened after that is that this guy named Judas Maccabees got so excited that he actually defeated the Syrians, threw off the Ptolemies, and actually for about 100 years Israel was a freestanding nation again. Totally defending themselves, totally holding their own, until 60 when the Romans show up with Pompey and they give in to him.